at the level of just to this lecture.
Okay, so I took it easy on you in the previous lecture. Now we're gonna like get serious. Not really. I think maybe looking at the slides, it may be that what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go as far as I can in this lecture as I arranged it, and then anything I don't get to because people ask questions, I want people to understand, I'll just push to the next lecture, because I think I have a little bit of space to do that. That's my plan. So I might not get through all of these slides, and it's better I don't and you understand as opposed to me racing through a whole bunch of stuff. Because it's gonna be a lot that's gonna start coming at you. So it's your responsibility to just basically, in some way, indicate that slow down, explain this, you can follow it over your chair, just do something, but indicate that I need to slow down if I'm going too fast, because there's a lot of stuff that is going to start to appear, okay? And it doesn't make any sense for me to just talk very fast at you when you not understand what I'm saying. It's not the point. Okay, so let's go forward here and try and get through this, but I don't think I'm going to get through all of this, and I'm fine with that. You should be fine with it too. You can always take it to the next lecture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reemphasize the points I was talking about already on parameter counting. Parameter counting first in the standard model, parameter counting in the SMEFT, and basically use that as a guide to thinking about perturbations to the standard model. And I'll talk about neutrino mass, because that's like a good simple one that has like a nice operator form, which is easier to understand. I'll talk about flavor symmetry violation, because of what was being asked in terms of the question of the number of parameters. The very large number of parameters is strongly associated with flavor indices. And that's one of the reasons why I was saying what I was saying in terms of the number of parameters isn't so many that we're actually dead in the water and can't actually do this program in a meaningful way. So we need to talk about flavor symmetry violation and how constrained it is in the standard model and how that pattern works and why that basically interacts with the standard model EFT sort of program in a useful way, not a devastating way. And then I'll talk a lot about the need for global studies. And then hopefully, this is going to touch on something that Cliff was mentioning earlier, this field redefinition invariance leading to field space geometry. So he went through a little bit of a discussion on that. I'll talk about that in terms of the SMEFT a little bit, because that's kind of leading into the geometric SMEFT stuff we hopefully get to by the end of the week. And then I'll talk about the lab example, going from an ST analysis to looking at electric precision data and really doing the full sort of operators that you can write in, the full set of them, and seeing how it doesn't get completely out of control at dimension 6. You can still do that, and it's a useful thing to do now that we've discovered the Higgs, and it actually leads to useful constraints. Okay, so this is what I want to get through, but it's a lot. So we might just stop halfway down or something. Okay, so let's count parameters. Counting is usually easy. So let's count parameters first in the standard model, just to remind ourselves how we do these sorts of things. Okay, so the standard model Lagrangian, again, just given here, where's my new stick? Can I ask a question? Why was the stick replaced? I have no idea. It's like the same stick that was changed.
It's changed.
Why was it changed?
Who changed it?
Well, maybe it's, well, no, let's not waste time. Okay, anyways, maybe someday someone can answer to me. Why was the stick changed? I don't know. Because it was a different stick, and then I had to change to the other stick. There's something about this that's better or worse. It's actually bothering me. I don't understand it. So, but it's fine. So this is the standard model Lagrangian, as you saw, and we're going to count the parameters in this theory. Okay, so the easiest ones to count are just the fermion masses, right? They come from, they overlap the left-right terms, but there's just masses associated with the fermion fields. Chiral symmetry is broken, so there's just 9. That's pretty easy, right? Just those fermion fields. A little more subtle is counting the parameters associated with the CKM matrix and flavor changing effects. Okay, so what you might think is, well, we're going to introduce the CKM matrix in great detail too, but hopefully you know of it. It's basically the matrix that appears in charge current interactions, and it can lead to flavor change between up and down quarks, a certain form, up and strange, and that sort of thing. You might look at this matrix and say, well, that's a complex matrix, and so it should have n squared real parameters in an n by n complex matrix, right? It's just math. But there's actually only this 2n minus 1 relative phases, and there's actually only n minus 1 squared physical parameters in this theory, once you take into account the rephasings that you can do. So it's a little bit subtle, perhaps, but that's actually how it works out, and you'll see in a little more detail why. And when you do that, you realize that it's not that many parameters, it's just there's these quark mixing parameters. So it's the 3 angles consistent with that formula, And then there's one phase, which will be the CP violating phase, that can be there. There's also 3 gauge couplings in the standard model. One associated with the strong force, G1 and G2. And then there's these 2 parameters in the electric sector, V and lambda. Okay, so that's the 18 parameters that Cliff mentioned and that you hear about. And usually you just actually refer to as 19 because that's the strong CP problem. You actually put in the extra parameter for the strong CP problem, and there's 19 parameters in the standard model. And that's writing down the G tilde operator form of the coefficient, okay, which is not written here, but can be written down. Okay, so that's 19 total. Okay, so 19 parameters, and I showed you this thing before, and we have a whole bunch of outstanding problems in the standard model of things that are not complete. Some of these things are opinions, other things are experimentally motivated problems. But the fact is, like, this relatively good agreement, considering all these outstanding issues, should surprise you, right? I mean, it should be like, well, how, I mean, why is it that everything's perturbing the standard model at all, right? Why isn't it just that it's just crap and it just doesn't work? And it's like a way that we can't even orient ourselves in perturbation theory in some sense, in field theory. So it's mostly decoupling, which is what I've emphasized, which is the way that this heavy mass scale dependence. If these problems are, many of these problems are associated with higher scales, then what I was saying about how the Taylor expansions can be done and how things organize themselves into local operators, which are perturbing this Tanner model story, can come in and really make it so that this makes a lot of sense in terms of perturbing this Tanner model description, right? So that's one reason it's holding up, basically. On the other hand, it isn't holding up at all. But again, because of effective field theory techniques, it's breaking in a controlled sense associated with a particular symmetry violation, right? So what I mean by that is there's a problem here. This Lagrangian, when I talked about masses, I gave masses to the leptons, but I didn't give masses to the neutrinos, right? This is a massless neutrino theory. This neutrinos have no mass, they have no mass differences. And that's wrong. So experimentally, we know that these mass differences are around. We don't know the normal versus the inverted hierarchy, but we measure neutrino oscillations and we know that essentially neutrinos have mass differences. And that's not incorporated into this theoretical description. So that's at a very low scale, and that's wrong. So how is it holding up at all that we can do all these predictions for LHC and all sorts of things and basically not be dead in the water? I mean, one should ask oneself this question. And it's, again, the thing I've been emphasizing over and over, this breakdown is associated with the symmetry violation. So if you follow the symmetries and orient your thinking not just in the sense of is it working or not working, but how is it breaking in terms of symmetry patterns and symmetry breaking effects, that's the useful way to think in field theory. So let's think about getting the neutrino mass in a controlled way in effective field theory violating lepton number. And in fact, that is another indication that thinking in this way is very powerful and useful when it's actually appropriate. So it's a remarkable fact that should make you want to do effective field theory, that if you actually just take the standard model Lagrangian and you say to yourself in the late 70s, early 80s, hey, neutrinos might have mass, that might explain the storm neutrino problem. And you say to yourself, okay, that's good, there's something to solve. What is the next term I can write down in terms of standard model field content? What does it do? And the next term you can write down is this term given here. It's basically these tilde field I introduced, there's a dagger, and then there's a charge conjugate lepton field. You can construct this dimension 5 operator. You can associate it with some cutoff scale, because this is now beyond dimension 4, there has to be some scale on the bottom to make up the dimensions. And it has some unknown Wilson coefficient. There's a charge conjugate field here, just for technical notation. Charge conjugation for me is defined this way. And then you can say to yourself, what are the neutrino mass differences starting to be indicated in the experiment? It's this sort of scales. And basically this works to give neutrinos mass, right? And when you actually infer the scale associated with this being order 1, you actually get this remarkably large scale of 10 to the 16 GeV, which is another answer to your question, possibly, one could argue. But you made an assumption here of C being order 1, right? So that's why I didn't bring it up before. That's a choice. But nevertheless, there's another scale, which needs to be indicated with neutrino mass. If you can give neutrinos mass in this way with this higher dimensional operator. Another reason I didn't bring it up and answer your question is you could also give neutrinos mass in a different way, with Dirac masses, right? So it's not quite a clean answer. But this, in the effective field theory sense, indicates that this is kind of a consistent description. And it's associated with lepton number violation. So that's the easiest way to do this is through the seesaw model. And essentially, if you want to basically get happy about effective field theory, you've already awarded a Nobel Prize for effective field theory, in a sense, for neutrino mass, right? Discovery of neutrino mass. These guys got it for the discovery of neutrino mass. And the easiest way to give neutrinos mass as an example of matching, that I want to just discuss a little bit briefly associated with Lepton number violation, is just the seesaw model. So let's talk about that a little bit. So usually if you do the simplest, stupidest thing in physics, that's the first thing to do, and then you can do more exotic things later. And the simplest, stupidest way to give mass to neutrinos, I think, is the following, which is you just basically take these right-handed neutrino fields, which you can write down, and have them have no charge. So they basically have these mass terms with charge conjugate fields. And don't worry about this technical comment. This basically just me defining my charge conjugation fields. But you give basically Majorana masses to neutrinos, and you basically integrate them out, and you get that dimension 5 operator. So you can write down the simplest model, just given here, couple these heavy neutrino fields to this HL orbital interaction, sometimes called. It's the thing that's allowed by the charges in the theory. You just add it to the standard model. This is just the propagation of the neutrino fields. This has an index because it has free flavor indices in general. And you just write down the simplest thing. We wrote it down in 79. And I guess none of them is in the audience. I can tell you, if you want to know an amusing anecdote about these people or about this, is that I wrote some papers on neutrinos. And I'm pretty sure these guys probably could get the Nobel Prize, the ones that are still alive, for the seesaw mechanism. It was like really pushed a little bit and it was like really validated. It's hard to really justify it because of the rules of the Nobel Prize, but you know, these guys are contenders. They're really in the game. And if you write papers on neutrinos and you leave out one of the references on the seesaw model, in my experience, you will get emailed to add in their reference because they really want, I mean, they each have like 2,000 to 3,000 citations, but they really want basically be in the game in terms of the referencing, in terms of the seesaw model. It's kind of amusing to receive those emails. But anyways, this is just the seesaw model. And if you just basically take this diagram with this heavy Majorana mass, take that mass to be heavy with this heavy Majorana state in the middle here, then you get this dimension 5 operator when you basically Taylor expand this guy, which is the name of the game in effective field theory. And it's associated with Lepton number violation, which is why I'm studying here. The Taylor expansion is formally of this form. Just get this heavy inverse mass scale dependence. And you also have higher order terms, which can be associated with like dimension 7 and higher order operators. It's an expansion. It's not just this leading term, which is usually what you do for the dimension 5 operator and stop. But it's actually an expansion. So all you do in effective field theory is essentially you Taylor expand and match. Matching means you do the Taylor expansion and you line up the operator forms that you get with what is written down in your bottom of effective field theory. That's really what matching is, systematically, and you do that order by order in perturbation theory. There's no more mystery to it. It's just doing the Taylor expansion and basically making everything line up. That's what it is. And you get this well-known result in terms of the dimension 5 operator. Okay, so you basically get this Wilson coefficient here associated with these couplings that appears for this dimension 5 operator. And when you expand and give the Higgs of Bev, you basically get the neutrino masses going as v squared, some unknown coefficient, and then divided by the heavy mass scale squared. Okay, so then the problem of the standard model is solved, right? You need neutrinos to have mass because you need neutrino mass differences which are experimentally found, and we can just do it in this very controlled way. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is as addressing this point of why is it holding up at all, right? That's a leading way to follow what you need experimentally. It's associated with the symmetry violation effect, and it gives exactly what you need, and you can calculate everything else that comes along with that. You can calculate the loop diagrams, you can calculate the dimension 7 effects, you can calculate everything that happens systematically. Just Taylor expand and keep going. And you find when you do those extra calculations, and I've done some of them, and other groups have done some of them as well, that the other effects you would see beyond the neutrino mass are small. Right? So it's another self-consistent test that you basically don't find some other deviation which is too big, which is already ruled out. So this is why the seesaw model is still a viable model for neutrino mass generation. But this is a question which is answered by calculation, not opinion. You just use the EFT techniques and just do the calculation and check. And it's actually a nice example of the power of effective field theory when you do those sorts of calculations. So that fixes the problem because the breakdown of the standard model, which is already present experimentally, you only have the charge left on having masses. we needed to have neutrinos have mass. We write this operator down, we take the Higgs to its bev, we get exactly what we need. We get exactly neutrino masses, and we can basically fit the parameters to the experimental data, and everything is then working perfectly well. Okay? And no other effects are showing up to screw up the whole LHC program because this is associated with lepton number violation. And we're not doing lepton number violating experiments at LHC. Right? So these effects basically project out of that experimental program. Hopefully that's clear. So then, if we do that, we have more parameters. We have these masses over here, and we have 7 more neutrino parameters. Their masses, their mixings, just like the CKM, there's a PMS matrix. And you can also have Majorana phases. The observation of them is difficult. Okay. So what happened here was the breakdown of the standard model in a controlled sense of effective field theory with a symmetry controlling that breakdown. Okay, so new parameters that break symmetries, I emphasized this point before, are things to think about in a controlled way and to go after systematically. And you probably need to treat them differently. So you probably should ask the question. So the first question you should ask when you're doing effective field theory, you write down first of all the operator basis, you have all the parameters you count. And then you should ask yourself the question, which of those parameters are associated with a violation of a symmetry present in the theory I'm perturbing around? Because those are the things you can probably find first. Okay, you should probably treat them differently than the parameters that are not associated with the symmetry violation compared to the model you're perturbing around. So that if it aligns with the symmetry violating effects with the standard model, those are certain parameters. And if it doesn't align with the symmetry violating effects of the standard model, those are another class of parameters. And it's a well-defined class to distinguish because it has to do with symmetry and quantum field theory. Okay, so new parameters that break symmetries, treat them differently and think very carefully about them. You'll probably see them first experimentally. Okay, standard model is wrong. It's over. Rescind the Nobel Prize. They did very well. So then basically you thinking that way, you want to then look at the symmetry structure of the standard model and the symmetry breaking structure of the standard model. We already did that a little bit with custodial symmetry effects. We want to do that with all the symmetry breaking effects in the standard model, really follow those and understand them well to organize our thinking. Okay? And the standard model has a beautiful symmetry breaking structure. So there's the Higgs, which breaks symmetry. There's flavor breaking, which we're going to talk about. There's just this kinetic term, which basically has all the symmetry being observed. There's custodial symmetry, which is violated things. And then there's also the lepton number violation. There's also baryon number, which I'm not even going to touch, but you can also write down operator forms to violate baryon number. And it's so strongly constrained experimentally, that's why I'm not going to be pursuing it further in terms of the discussion, but that's something you can also look at. And you can understand why baryon number being preserved as well as it doesn't invalidate the whole SMEFT program or hep program. It's because the RG evolution of the effective theories, they basically conserve the symmetries of the theories. They have the symmetry breaking pattern of the theory to write down. And so the baryon number violating effects are sequestered. They don't mix through RG evolution into the other operator forms that don't violate baryon number. If they did mix with the operator forms that preserve baryon number, well, we'll be screwed. Essentially, there would be no reason to do the SMEFT program because then the scale associated with baryon number violation would be so large, we would know that the effects were already ruled out that we're looking for experimentally in the LHC programs, the SMEFT techniques. Okay, so the symmetry separation of parameter counts, which is preserved under RG evolution, is something that's very meaningful and very important in effective field theory thinking. Okay, so let's look at flavor symmetry because it has a lot of parameters and it controls a lot of the parameters you introduce at dimension 6. Okay, so how does the flavor symmetry program work in the standard model? How does the breaking work in the standard model? Let's remind ourselves of that. So by flavor symmetry, I mean you have different flavors of the fermion fields and you can rotate them into one another. Very simply, there's a U3 to the 5th symmetry, and you can rotate the quark fields, the lepton fields, and the up and downs, and the left and the rights. Sorry, not up and downs, but the left and the right fields separately. And they have these U3 to the 5th flavor symmetry rotations. The quark ones I'm just grouping here, the left ones I'm grouping here. So there's a very well-defined sense in which flavor symmetry is restored in the standard model, which is to turn off the Yukawa interactions, turn off the masses, which distinguish the flavors. Right? So if you do that, you turn off these Yukawas, take all of these Yukawa couplings to 0, then you have this U3 to the 5th symmetry. And it's important to think that way because then you can understand how the breaking of flavor symmetry has to start to come into experimental predictions. It's usually good to go to a symmetry symmetric point and then look at the perturbations breaking it in a spurion analysis to basically follow how things work in terms of predictions. So technically, you can think of these Yukawas as symmetry breaking spurion fields. Okay? And if you want to do that, what you do is you basically give them the transformation properties they need in the flavor rotations, that even when you work on these Yukawas and they're not zero, they still restore the symmetry. And then you basically write down everything that's consistent with the symmetry, and you introduce enough powers of these to basically get all the indices to be contracted correctly. And it tells you how the breaking of the flavor symmetry works, because when the Yukawas then take on their very small numerical values, it tells you the control pattern of symmetry violation that you actually have. Okay, that's why you do this sort of technique. It's useful. All right, so you can make separate rotations on the left and right-hand fermion fields before you turn off the masses, and then the kinetic terms are fine, all right? So the kinetic terms are invariant. But when you turn on the Yukawas, you don't have the ability to do those rotations anymore simultaneously, okay? And the way that the flavor symmetry breaks is also charged with also associated with the generators that are present in the theory, the SU2 generators, the neutral currents versus charged currents. Okay, so the kinetic terms have different eigenbases in general than the Yukawa terms. And when you want to diagonalize to basically have things propagate in a way when you have a well-defined state propagating, you basically have that difference in the diagonalization of the Yukawa terms and the kinetic terms be dumped essentially into the left-handed doublet fields. So you do these rotations, you pull out a common rotation, and then the difference in rotations for the up and downs is what you call the CKM matrix. Okay? It's because the eigenbases are not simultaneously diagonalizable. That's why it's there fundamentally. Now, if you do these rotations on the right-handed fields, all the generators go through. The S2 and the hypercharge generator go through the right-handed field rotations, everything's fine. But what's a bit interesting is for the left-handed doublet fields, the generators for the neutral currents commute, but the charge current generators do not commute. Okay, so the ones that with the neutral currents commute, so there's no flavor changing neutral currents at tree level, but the charge currents don't commute, so you can get flavor changing effects associated with charge currents at tree level in the standard model. That's basically all following from basic generator algebra and that sort of thinking. Again, you need to stop me if I start going too quickly. So we associate flavor changing effects with the charge currents. The charge currents is associated with the W, right? And that's where this CKM matrix appears. You have the W coupled to these different fermion fields. You get these off-diagonal entries, which you saw before. Okay? So flavor breaking effects is going to be associated with these charge currents being around. What you can build up in terms of fun diagrams with these charge currents. Okay? So consistent with the counting I told you before, where it's not that all those parameters are independent, but only a subset of those parameters that are present naively in that n-squared matrix are independent. You can use a very useful parameterization called the Wilkenstein parameterization, making those parameter appearances in the phase manifest. And you're just rewriting down the CKM matrix, expanding in those parameters being small. That's all that's happened here. It's a very controlled form. And essentially, you can then look at the flavor changing pattern of the standard model by taking lots of different measurements where you look at the charge currents and how they appear in diagrams of the standard model, infer the values of these coefficients from different measurements, and look and see if it's a consistent description of the data. And what you should also find is that this is a unitary transformation, which it is by construction. You should be able to take rows and columns of this matrix, and you should basically get either 0 or 1, depending on the row or column that you took. That just means it's a closed unitary transformation from one set of eigenbases to another set of eigenbases. So in particular, this set of complex numbers should sum to 0. And you can just look at how you measure these different complex numbers and different experimental results, combine them up, and test to see if that actually is true in the data. And that would mean, if it's true, that the standard model flavor symmetry breaking pattern is being validated by the global data set. So that was a program well, it's still a program, but it was a very active program in the 80s, and the 90s, and the 2000s. And it's validated the standard model flavor symmetry breaking pattern quite extensively over the last couple of decades. Is this going to work? Okay. So the CKM matrix should be unitary if it's just a unitary transformation between one eigenbasis and another eigenbasis. So this stuff should add to 0. So this is a picture pictorially checking to see if it adds to 0. Okay, these three sides of this picture are the three complex numbers being added up, and if the triangle closes, it's that relationship is being preserved. And what's being shown on this picture is all sorts of different measurements proportional to these various CKM parameters being combined up and consistently showing that the global data set is indicating that this pattern of flavor violation is being indicated in the data. It also allows you to basically get numerical values for these parameters, and you understand the CP violation being very small in the standard model. It's associated with that phase that's in the CKM matrix. But you also have to basically, I don't want to get into it in great detail, you have to think a little more carefully about how CP violation comes into an experimental result. It actually comes through an invariant, which is a field definition invariant, it's known as the Yarl's problem invariant. And it's incredibly small. It's proportional to these very small perturbative things. And it basically is a higher order power in those very small perturbative parameters. So you understand why CP violation is very small in the standard model as well, with this standard description. It comes through that one phase, and then how it appears in experimental results is this complicated field redefinition invariant structure that has to appear in terms of the experimental result. Okay, so this is the lightning reminder of how flavor violation has been validated in the standard model. We could have a whole series of lectures on flavor and flavor symmetry breaking. I can't go into it in more detail, but that's basically the idea. So I'm telling you this because then you can compare with the number of parameters that come in for dimension 6 operators. All right, so if you calculate something like a meson mixing diagram like this, the very specific form of flavor symmetry breaking in the standard model tells you how the Spurian analysis, you basically have to have flavor breaking. It basically has to do because these two guys are not simultaneously diagonalizable. So this tells you the power of Yukawa's and the CKM factors that have to appear, which appears exactly in these scattering diagrams. That's where the power is in front of the CKM here. And that also helps you understand why there's a leading mass dependence associated with the gym mechanism and the breaking of the gym mechanism, leading to a very hierarchical and very specific pattern of meson mixing that is validated by experiment. Okay, so it's not just the fact that that it's small, it's that the pattern that is consistent between the different meson mixing experiments has been validated in the data. And it all follows from this very particular breaking of flavor symmetry in the standard model. And you can fundamentally derive it all from that Spurian analysis, promoting the catalyst to spurions and then following this. Now, if you compare that to what would happen if you just wrote down a dimension 6 operator with indices that are flavor indices with the general parameters you're worried about, these Wilson coefficients, this is a lot of parameters, and those parameters, even if this scale is TV-ish, which is what we're after, if this is a TV suppression scale, all the powers of suppression that are here from these small powers of off-diagonal CKM factors, and this small breaking of the top compared to the VEV, and the fact that this is a loop diagram in the standard model, even though you make this a higher scale, like TeV, if it doesn't have an alignment with that flavor breaking pattern, essentially it'll be too big an effect. And in particular, if you start to look at different measurements where the same Wilson coefficient can come in, it'll break the pattern. Okay, so if you don't align in any way with flavor symmetries, you just have like order TV scale suppression scales for arbitrary dimension 6 operators with arbitrary numbers of parameters, arbitrary orientations, it's over. It's already ruled out. But it doesn't have to be that way, obviously, because just like in the case of lepton number, which I talked about, you can have flavor symmetry breaking patterns which appear in the Wilson coefficients and can align things and have a pattern of breaking that actually makes things make sense so that the coefficient, the cutoff scale can be more. And that's not something that's ruled out, and if it's indicated by experiment, I think we just accept that that has to be the case as indicated by experiment and go after the remaining effects which aren't so constrained. But that reduces the number of parameters you're after to a subset from the total number of parameters you started with. Many of the parameters will then be controlled by aligning the flavor breaking pattern with the pattern of the standard model, because otherwise the TV scale cutoff scales you're after are already ruled out for arbitrary flavor breaking. Right? So that's basically the way we think about things in terms of parameter counts. And that basically reduces the number of parameters that you introduce and go after in terms of LHC studies for those really quite valid reasons motivated by experiment. Okay. So it's not just that meso-mixing experiments have a very specific pattern of flavor breaking effects associated with the CKM matrix and the GIM mechanism. It's also the statement I made about flavor symmetry and no flavor changing intercurrence at tree level was at tree level, right? You can still get flavor changing intercurrence at loop level. So you can think about this sort of 3-point function where one of these fields could be something like a Higgs field or Z. And you have some diagram, some loop diagram here, and these flavor indices can be off diagonal there in the standard model. And they could also be off diagonal in the case of SMEFT perturbations operators that you write down. So how much trouble are we in for that? Well, in the standard model case, you will still have a controlled breaking associated with the CKM factors and the GIM mechanism. And you can then have arbitrary effects like this, which you have to worry about. For the same reason, you basically have to align these effects with the standard model effects to go after TV scale level deviations. So you have to assume some flavor symmetry, essentially, if you're doing these sort of program relays. No flavor changing intercurrence at tree level, but you do get these flavor changing intercurrence at one loop. They're exactly this. And it's quite straightforward. You can probably do this calculation yourself. It's just there. And what you find, like this pattern, is you'll notice there's different powers of the CKM. What you'll notice is a breaking associated with the GIM mechanism. And it's a loop level effect again. Okay, and this is just for the Higgs off-diagonal indices in the standard model, one loop effect, and also for the Z off-diagonal indices in the standard model. This exists, just really small, like really, really small, experimentally, but it's there. Okay, so perturbations, which are small and aligned with that sort of flavor symmetry breaking pattern, are fine, and we should go after those experiments. So if we do that, we go after these things experimentally, what do we get? And we start writing down arbitrary flavor indices and thinking about perturbations to the standard model story in Collider physics like Z decay or Higgs decay, these sorts of things. So you basically, for these 3-point functions, you have some standard models with some SMEFT perturbation. That SMEFT perturbation is a Taylor expansion, has dimension 6 effects, also dimension 8 effects, dimension 6 squared effects. It's an expansion. So we just write down the 2 leading terms in the expansion in just this general way. You have a dimension 6 effect with these flavor indices, you have a dimension 8 effect with different flavor indices, and it can be associated with this 3-point function. And you just square this guy. So how does the symmetry breaking pattern work? Okay, so we're trying to orient our thinking around that. This has the standard model symmetry breaking pattern essentially squared. Right? And if that's a very hierarchical, very small symmetry breaking, that's really small. This has the interference of the standard model with the dimension 6 guy. So even if you didn't align these indices with the symmetry breaking pattern of the standard model, this would still be numerically suppressed because the standard model symmetry breaking pattern would still numerically make it small. The question is, does it make it small enough to basically compete with this, or is it still too big a perturbation? But it still makes it numerically quite small just by interfering with the standard model. That's a projector. So that's important to realize when we start to talk about the general number of parameters that are present in SMEFT. We're talking about dimension 6 linear interference effects. The standard model is an amazingly good projector for symmetry breaking effects. Okay, and the number of parameters that come into some experimental measurements at linear dimension 6 order can be very much suppressed compared to what you would naively expect because of that symmetry projection, projecting out a lot of parameters, and that is just standard model physics, which we know exists. Okay, so it's not a speculation. That reduces parameter counts coming into the results. So that happens here. This is just the dimension 6 squared part, self-squared part. Now, if this is aligned in its symmetry breaking pattern with the standard model in terms of flavor symmetry effects, then this double suppression, this double suppression in terms of the symmetry breaking effects, and these cross terms will all kind of be on the same footing for flavor symmetry breaking effects or some other symmetry breaking effects. But if this guy, if you're just living off the fact that this one interferes here, so this is numerically small, and therefore this still gets numerical suppression, then this part can be bigger than this, just because it doesn't have small symmetry breaking effects associated with the standard model suppressing it. Okay, so people go after that all the time when they do sort of flavor breaking physics and studies of that form. They go after that all the time experimentally. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that other than this also exists, which is the same order in lambda. Okay, so there's also one over lambda to the fourth, and it interferes with the standard model. So depending on what you're looking at experimentally, you should be consistent with these effects if you're going after these sorts of effects. Okay, but this just gives you an idea. If you start to talk about the standard model symmetry breaking pattern alone, it starts to project out a lot of parameters in the linear dimension 6 interference. And if you want to go to dimension 6 squared to get some of those effects, you should always be worried about the dimension 8 effects also of the same order in terms of the lambda suppression. Okay? Very straightforward, but that's basically the idea of what makes the parameter counts out of control. So now that I've prepared you to not freak out when we talk about the numbers and see the numbers, let's look at the dimension 6 operator basis and its symmetry parameter counts alone, or the parameter counts. This is the dimension 6 operator basis. You were asking about some of these operator forms, but this is just operator forms which are basically anomalous Yukawa couplings, some derivatives acting on the Higgs, the effects on the potential, couplings of the Higgs to vector bosons, dipole operator forms with sigma mu nu, so it changes the parallel structure. And then you also have anomalous Z and W decays coming from these guys. That's essentially what's going on. This is just a notation. And this is the 4 fermion operators, which there's a lot of. And these flavor indices are there, but you might not be able to see them. But they're the scary things which lead to the large number of parameter counts. Because 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 is a big number. 81. So that's why you get these big numbers in terms of the total number of parameters. Okay, so if you look at the total number of parameters at dimension 6 that can interfere with the standard model, it's 2,499 parameters that come in. But as I've tried to say over and over and over and over again, you shouldn't just look at the total number, you should look at how the number aligns with symmetry breaking effects, because that's what's useful for experiment. CP odd versus CP even, big difference. It's about half of them are in CP odd versus CP even, and CP violating effects in standard model are very small. So when you interfere with those standard model effects, they'll be highly projected out. And CP odd stuff is 1,149 of that, it's almost half of it. If you look about 1 versus 3 generations, so you start to think about not necessarily CP violating effects, but flavor off diagonal effects that appear in like 3-point functions, the IJ indices we just looked at, or in the other sort of operator forms, the Meson mixing lattice, with 3 indices. 1 versus 3 parameters for CP even takes you from 53 parameters to 1,350. If you start to focus on phase space regions and sort of experimental measurements that can be made precise, Higgs combined with left electric precision data and some diboson data, like I think we should do, and we are doing LHC, this 53 goes down to about 30. Okay, so a combination of flavor projection, symmetry understanding, and basically looking at what can be there in terms of suppression scales in the FUTV region in a self-consistent way is what leads you to these like 30 parameter fits in the SMEFT. Now the other parameters are around leading to this, but they're not just being ignored. They're not appearing in the experimental results for good theoretical reasons in terms of following symmetry breaking. So hopefully you're not too scared by that number. I feel a need to, we counted that number, so I feel a need to like not terrify you from that number. So that's the summary story of the number. I don't know if you've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but basically that's the message. Don't panic. It's not as bad as you might think. We can actually do a meaningful program.
You said you assume the flavor universality.
Yeah, flavor universality goes in this direction.
CP even.
It can be CP even. If it's CP odd, then
You don't have both.
you can have both.
You have both.
Yeah. So you can have flavor breaking. So yes, I'll get to that in a second. But you can have both. So MFV is usually defined, doesn't have any other phases, which is kind of a tricky thing that's stuck in. But you can do both. You can do like generalized MFV with phases, but it's so strongly constrained. Essentially, people know you can do that, but they don't. They just do MFV with no extra CP violating phases, which is an important assumption. You can do both. Okay, so are there too many parameters? No, is the short answer. Because again, as I said over and over, there's a numerical expression, there's a projector effect because you're interfering with the standard model amplitude at dimension 6. Okay, we talked about these guys, and this is IR physics that projects out parameters. Okay, so it's really physics that we know. So when we get to counting parameters, getting to your question slightly, I didn't do the CP odd case here. Well, actually it's here. I didn't do it. You can basically see that when you look at 1 generation versus 3 generations, in general, how the parameter counts work. Now, what are these pole parameters? These are the parameters that are associated with the V squared over lambda squared expansion. The H dagger H over lambda squared expansion, I've mentioned a bunch of times, is a distinct expansion parameter that we have great theoretical control over in terms of what we can do interfacing with the data set. And this is one of the reasons we have great theoretical control. It's just there's not many parameters that come in at dimension 6 when you're talking about things that are precisely measured experimental measurements that are dominated by standard model phase-space populations. So not tails and distributions, but things near resonance structures. So either the Higgs resonance is there, or one of the decays of the Higgs resonance, one of the bosons is near on shell, or LEP data. Anything that has a near resonant on shell phase-space pole will have that V squared over lambda squared expansion parameter being the relevant one. And that's why you get fewer parameters in part. But it's also the flavor symmetry assumption you can do. 1 generation versus 3 generations is a very significant effect in terms of the number of parameters. If you do this full U3 to the 5th, so no flavor breaking effects beyond standard model flavor breaking effects, you get down a little bit. And if you have this minimal flavor violating pattern, you can have a couple more parameters, including deleting spurion breakings. Not including extra CV violating phases, but just deleting top breakings for breakings. Okay, so this is not that many parameters that project into the experimental program. It's all on the order of about 30 parameters, roughly. And so that's what people are going after experimentally in theory groups are. Now what's going on here, this phase-space population effect, there's another important effect going on. When there's projecting out of a number of other parameters which you could write down, you're actually also using the fact that the bosons of the standard model are narrow. And I'll show you this for lab data in a moment in detail. And essentially what happens is that the narrowness of the standard model bosons, the width appears in terms of projecting out other effects, and it's the width over the mass that projects out other effects. So for example, 4 fermion operators can affect electric precision data, but they project out because they're further suppressed by the width over the mass in the near on-shell region, near the resonance pole, because they don't go up with the resonance. Okay. I'm going to take a slight detour for a moment. I hope this works. This is going to start to lay the groundwork of getting into the geometric approaches at the end of the week. So I've emphasized over and over, probably too many times, the importance of symmetry in terms of controlling what we're thinking about in terms of parameters. And Cliff also talked about this, which is that you can change your operator basis by field redefinitions. So let's think about field redefinitions that preserve symmetries, which don't confuse things too much. And think about how this kind of informs us that we need a global approach combining multiple data sets in the SMEFT. Okay, so we have a SMEFT Lagrangian, and we want to basically start to calculate this theory. So I told you I used the Warsaw basis when I've done what I've been showing you and calculate. But you can say, well, before we get to that point, let's write down all the operator forms that we can write down that preserve the symmetries of the theory. Not just go to the Warsaw basis, just write everything down. If you write down everything, you'll get more operator forms. This is just a simple example of dressing this thing up and focus on the V field and how you can redefine it. You just start writing down operator forms. You write down these ones which are in the Warsaw basis, but you can also write down some other ones like this, like that, which are not in the Warsaw basis, this one and this one. And you can write them down. They don't violate the theory symmetries, so people don't use them. Or people choose a basis where they're there, but one of these other operators isn't there. So what the heck is going on? This is a very specific example related to what Cliff was talking about, changing the representation of the theory of the Lagrangian. Okay, so you can perform a field redefinition in this over-complete theory, which has extra operator forms, which are not all independent actually. And you can just change your field variables, or in another way of thinking about it, you can fix your field variables because it always has this ambiguity until you do this fixing. And you can just do this transformation and choose a B2. So you specify what field basis you're working in. And you're allowed to choose that B2. Okay? And the observables are going to be independent of that choice because it's a choice you're making as a human, and we're not that important at the end of the day. So you can choose specifically your value of B2 to cancel off this operator form. So you just choose this guy and shift it in such a way to cancel this off. It's a free choice you're allowed to make. And the consequence of doing that free choice is essentially you shift the Wilson coefficients of the remaining operator forms in a correlated way. But this is a way that you basically are starting to use your field redefinition freedom, which is there to start with, pick a field basis. And by picking that field basis, you're basically reducing your redundancy in your theoretical description, which was there to start with, to a smaller and smaller form, and then you can calculate efficiently. If you don't do this, you can choose not to do this. If you go back and calculate like this, what will happen is when you calculate observables, cancellations will always happen, so you don't have as many free parameters as you think. And the only things that don't have cancellations happening associated with them will be a parameter count, which is associated with a non-redundant operator basis, which means you do all these field redefinitions to start with to cancel off everything at the start of the calculation that you can cancel, and then what remains will be something that can appear in an experiment. So you might as well just do it at the start to be efficient. Usually it's a good idea, and you can do that, cancel this off, at the cost of shifting these other guys. And this does do something important, which is that when you're calculating this theory and you use a fixed basis, the operator forms you retain in your theoretical description, they have this like meaning which also knows about the field redefinitions that was done to basically establish the operator basis. Okay, so they have a contextual meaning. They know about what was removed in terms of the Wilson coefficient as well as just what you're keeping in your basis. Okay, so you should start to think more globally in terms of the properties of the theory, and you should start to think about how what remains when you do this procedure can actually project onto amplitudes. Okay, but this tells you that you need to do a global program. By choosing field redefinitions, you can move around some of the operator forms. You can get rid of some things that appear in some class of measurements and move them into another place. It's only when you combine a whole set of measurements that you actually get a meaningful closure in terms of the parameters, measuring inputs and getting to outputs. So we actually have to do this sort of thing where we actually have to do Baba scattering and W and Z anomalous couplings. We have to worry about input parameters, and we have to worry about things like Fields physics. We have to combine them up in a consistent global pattern, global measurements in this EFT study. So we have to do a pretty global effort. Okay, but as I try to emphasize, the symmetry controls things, and so you can also choose your measurements so you can actually have a reasonable number of parameters in that program. Okay, so when the field redefinitions preserve symmetries, it's pretty easy to interpret things, and essentially symmetries are still a good guide to the parameter counts. Now, this is the important point, which has been realized in the last couple of years. That freedom, which Cliff is also emphasizing, means something important in terms of what actually appears in terms of experimental amplitudes, like the amplitudes you can actually measure. And it's really this field redefinition invariance leads to field space geometry as being a key concept that's come to the fore recently. This is like the start of trying to get you to understand where we're going by the end of the week. So it's like this. I mean, it's not exactly like this, but it's close enough. If you think in general relativity about general coordinate variance, that general coordinate variance has a consequence in terms of the math that you do to basically start to think about general relativity. You basically are doing differential geometry, and you start to focus in on the quantities that don't care about what you choose for your coordinate system. Those are quantities that define the geometric properties of real space. It's like curvature of the space. It doesn't care about the coordinate system you choose. And you start to write down structures like this, Einstein's field equations, relating things such as the same transformation properties under V and U. Okay? The analogy in the geoSMEFT approach we're going to get to is essentially this field redefinition freedom that we have, choosing our field variables, as I just illustrated, as a choice that we can make. That has a consequence in that what we start to think about, like this, are mathematical quantities describing the properties of these field spaces, which are independent of essentially the choice that we're making. So the differential geometry quantities that characterize the field spaces, things like the curvature of the field spaces. And that's what appears in the experimental amplitude. That's what appears in the amplitude perturbations at the end of the day. The operator forms combine up to express themselves through those sorts of quantities. Okay, so we're going to talk about these two. Cliff talked about this one. And this is going to be a metric that we're going to introduce with two indices. Depends on the scalar fields. And here I'm using real scalar field coordinates, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a verb as I know. You can also do this general Yang-Mills term, where these three W's and a D are being grouped up, and you can actually talk about this sort of object. This is another, basically two-index object, a metric on field spaces that will appear in amplitudes. Okay? So hopefully that's somewhat clear. And people have been doing it. There's a Russian that did it in the 80s, is always a Russian. We've been thinking about this the last couple of years. And you start to do things like this. Okay, I'm going to step back to dimension 6 operators in a moment, but I'm just trying to preview you of where we're going to get to by the end of the week, talking about this stuff. In a specific operator basis, you can basically write down the Wilson coefficients in a specific operator basis, the dimension 6 Wilson coefficients, and they appear in a specific structure. This is how the Warsaw basis appears in this guy, the square root of this metric. This tilde is because you're basically doing b squared over lambda squared. I told you this is the expansion parameter that's relevant for these sort of measurements that are near standard phase-space poles, and that is so tied to geometry. But these are specific Wilson coefficients in the Warsaw basis, and they arrange themselves in this way for this 2-index object at dimension 6. You can write down this expression to dimension 8, or 10, or 12, 24. We actually know the all-orders form of this expression. Similarly, for this guy in the Warsaw basis, you just have this particular form in terms of the Wilson coefficients you write down. Now, there's small perturbations here, so we have a semi-positive definite matrix, and a well-defined inverse and square roots. And these are useful quantities, and this is a useful way to think. Why? I'm going to emphasize this multiple times, but basically they're useful because they dictate more efficiently what appears in the amplitude perturbation. Okay, so when you do an amplitude perturbation, you have a standard amplitude with some symmetry structure or symmetry breaking structure, and there'll be some function of kinematics, and multiplying that will be some number which depends on unknown parameters. And that will be defined by field redefinition invariant quantities defining these field spaces. That number, that combination that will appear. Because at the amplitude level, at the observable level, the observables are field redefinition invariant. So the only thing that can appear are the field redefinition of invariant quantities. So the individual Wilson coefficients in an operator basis that you choose are not themselves field redefinition invariant. They'll always combine up into quantities that appear in this way. And we can identify those thinking in terms of field space geometry from the start and just calculate more efficiently. That's the idea. It works. Okay, so that was just kind of the preview. That might have been way too much too quickly. Don't worry if you don't understand it yet. I'm going to keep repeating this. I'm going to come back to this a couple times. And by the end of the week, you should understand this in terms of great detail. Is there any quick questions on this? Because this is conceptually got a bit interesting. Yeah?
Your the metric of your space also can contain the derivatives?
No, well, yeah, in general, yes. This one does not. This was associated with this expansion parameter, but in general, it can be done. That's also something that's been sorted out recently. Yeah. In general, yes. In practice, for the way we're going to do things, no. But we don't need that for the calculations I'm going to show you. But there's no formal barrier. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
So for example, this GAB5, when Higgs develops a pair,
Yeah,
that will modify the kinetic term for the gauge kinetic term, right?
that's right.
And then do you, when you do this, when you apply this SMEFT for data analysis, do you renormalize all gauge field and gauge coupling, etc.?
Yep. So we canonically normalize, and you can actually think of this as a veil line, essentially, that's basically defining the asymptotic states. And what's really cool, which is what I want to get to, is not only do we do that, and the theory organizes itself in such a way that we do that efficiently, super efficiently, not just at dimension 6, but at all orders. That procedure, canonically normalizing things, actually shows up in the data, and it shows up as the flat directions that are in electron data, which is an amazing thing. Let me get to showing you that. But yes, we do exactly that. And it's kind of beautiful how it fits together and explains a pattern that was in the data, which people had trouble understanding. But it comes exactly from that procedure. I'll get to it soon if I get time. How am I doing for time?
7.
I got 7?
7 minutes.
Oh, there's no way I'm getting through the whole lecture. I'm halfway through. It's fine. I'll push into the other. It's fine.
Can you comment on the basis? You said the basis independence.
Yeah. So the geometric structures will be basis independent.
When you talk about particular processes, you have to fix the initial and final states,
Oh yeah, that's true.
and then you have to choose particular basis to describe.
Oh, field basis.
The
Yeah, that's
field
right.
basis, you
That's
have to fix the
Yeah.
certain initial and final states. So what is the basis independent observables? Like, what thing you think?
So you have to choose your asymptotic pole poles of what are the external states of the theory. That's true. And then the field redefinition variance applies itself to some initial and final state, the redefinitions that you can do on what you mean by that initial and final state. So there's a well-defined meaning in which, and I'll show you some formulas of this form, the structures that appear here multiplying the kinematics will be characterized by geometric structures in these field spaces. It's like variations of metrics, combinations of metrics, and that sort of thing. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm not sure if it does. You have to fix your field basis, it's true. But once you do fix your field basis, what appears is still geometric in its structure and is characterizing the field space dressing of particular kinematic forms, which are characterizing the properties of these geometric spaces, which are field redefinition invariant. So let me maybe show you and ask again, because we're going to get through this multiple times. Yeah. Okay. We'll get back to it. There's no chance of getting through all my slides, but that's okay. I'll try and get through that. And I'll get to the point I was saying about how this works. Okay, so LEP. Let's talk about LEP in the time I've left, probably into tomorrow or the next lecture. So what was LEP? LEP was a measurement, set of measurements, scanning through the Z pole and looking at the precise measurements of that Z resonance. By a precise measurement of that Z resonance, I mean they took 155 inverse picobarns of data. Like when you sneeze at LHC, you probably erase this amount of data from the computer systems. It's like not much data at all for nowadays, but back then it was an enormous amount of data, which told us a lot. And there's about 40 inverse picobarns of off-peak data combined in as well, because they had to scan through the Z peak to reconstruct this resonance feature. They reconstructed this resonance feature and they inferred things about the Z width, the Z mass, with some description of the Z mass, Z width, sorry, coming into this structure. They measured and extracted some soft photon emission. This is why it's called pseudo-observables at LEP. They looked at some final states. And then they constructed basically ratios of different final states. And they put the full data set together into a set of pseudo-observables describing LEP. Usually the parameters extracted are of this form. The total heteronomic cross-section, ratios of compared to the total width, and then the total Z width, and then the Z mass. Okay? And then you can also construct things like four backward asymmetries and the individual decay widths of the Z. Okay. Now, to study something like LEP, you need numbers, right? And you need inputs. You need basically to have a bunch of numbers which define what you mean by your theoretical prediction to compare to experiment. So you have been taught, and you know that something like the VEB is 246 GeV. But that's something that's actually extracted from an experimental result. And in particular, it's extracted from muon decay. I'm emphasizing this in the standard model because the story changes in the SMEFT, and we have to be consistent in the SMEFT, doing all these redefinitions. Let's start with the standard model. We want to use this VEB to make predictions at lab, to compare with what we experimentally measure. How do we get it? What we do is we measure this 4 fermion vertex for muon decay, and we basically fit this coefficient. We measure the total decay width and fit the coefficient. Easy. Not so easy. Because if you look closely at that formula, we need to know the muon mass to get that GF. And the way we get that is essentially some other experimental result, which is actually this hyperfine splitting of muon and muonium. And that actually gives you not just the muon mass itself, but the muon mass to the electron mass. If you know the electron mass, and you know this experimental result, you know the muon mass, and they can use those to get GF. Fine. How do we know the electron mass? Well, we know the electron mass essentially for something you do in undergraduate physics, which is just an oil drop experiment. So basically you look at the movement of an electron in a magnetic field, and then essentially you use an oil drop experiment to get the charge, you use this, you get the electron mass, from the electron mass, you get the muon mass, from the muon mass, you get GF, and you actually save that data. I'm telling you this because it's always a pattern of experimental results that are being used to infer some numerical values which are used to make other predictions. That's the way it always is if you look closely. And the thing in the SMEFT you have to worry about and be careful about is how much of each of the step of these stories change because of local operators that you can write down, higher dimensional contact operators. When it can change in a significant way, you have to include that contact operator essentially in your data analysis, because otherwise you're just being inconsistent. Okay, so this is usually just boiled down to like a simple story. People say, look, we study electric precision data and we use a GF alpha electromagnetic MZ input parameter scheme. And hidden in the fact that they say this sentence means they did a whole pattern of experimental measurements to get this, to then use a number, and so on and so forth. So that's always the case. You just have to be a bit careful about what your inputs are in terms of how SMEFT predictions can come in, so you're just consistently analyzing the data. Because all the operator forms that are there in terms of this global analysis. And remember, field redefinitions move operator forms around in different spots. You have to do a global analysis, so you have to be careful to track everything. Okay, so when we do electric precision data in the SMEFT, what do? If we use this input parameter scheme, with all the subtleties I just said, you basically have numerical values. From those numerical values measured at different scales, you basically define some Lagrangian parameters, tree level. You can also do this at 1 loop or 2 loop. And then from that, you predict some experimental results for all the stuff I was talking about in the student observables. The decay width, the ratios of decay width, total drawn cross section, so on and so forth. So you go through the standard model Lagrangian, and you basically write down decay widths at tree level, and you predict a whole bunch of stuff. And you can do that with loop improvements, and that's what they do. This actually has 2 loop results built in, so you really need to do 2 loops, otherwise you get it wrong in the standard model. It's not consistent with the data. Now, when we look at electric precision data, this has not changed all the way back then. There's differences now. We're going to get to the W mass in this interpretation, but there's some skew here, which is interesting. Couple sigma. It's not exactly standard model like, but it's no statistically significant evidence of physics beyond the standard model. We just basically fit the whole pattern of measurements, and that's what we just do. And so there's constraints upon the combination of Wilson coefficients that come in, but it's not that all the Wilson coefficients are 0. It's just there's constraints we need to incorporate. So when you do this ST approach, which I talked about, of having 2-point functions, one of the things that was not good, which should concern you, because of what I just said about field redefinition and variancy and field space geometry and all that sort of thing, is that you can do a field redefinition, move things that would appear as a Wilson coefficient in the 2-point function, associated with mass, and you can turn it into this vertex correction, which you're neglecting in ST studies by definition. That's always been something that was like, didn't make sense, kind of fundamentally, but it made sense in a practical sense, which is that if you constrain yourself to some theoretical approaches, some theoretical models, where the dominant effect in the model appears here, then it's kind of okay, because then essentially that's physically picking up the perturbation that you would expect there to be associated with mass generation. It was never deeply field redefinition invariant. We're moving beyond that sort of thing now in sort of SMEFT analyses to do only things that are field redefinition invariant, using geometry if we can, but just in general, we're keeping all the operator forms around, including these vertex corrections as well as the 2-point corrections. Okay, that's what the modern SMEFT analyses do. And we found a Higgs, so there's really no reason to focus on just the 2-point function effects. Okay, so you saw this a little while ago. I was thinking this would be multiple days, so I'm just reminding you of this, so you can look on this slide to remind yourself of this definitions. What do we need to do when we start to do SMEFT analyses? Well, we have to basically be consistent, like I was stressing. Every time we have an input defining a numerical value, we have to put on all the higher dimensional operators that can be there and shift what we've inferred from experiment consistently, and then predict things consistently. So this higher dimensional operator can be present. One of them can be present here, another one can be present as a 4-fermion operator. These guys are coming from this one, and this is a 4-fermion operator structure, and they can shift this inferred value of 246 by this contribution. It's something about delta GF and what people do in their studies. And that needs to be taken into account. So every time you use 246 when you make a standard model prediction, you have to then pop out a correction factor like this in some prediction that you're doing in the SMEFT. There's not that many operator forms that appear in this analysis. It's not the 2,499 parameters appear, so that's just disabling from the start. Because of the reasons I stressed, off-diagonal indices on the Z, and the controlling symmetry properties of the standard model you're interfering with, and the fact that you have 4-fermion operators projecting out because of the narrow width effects, you only have about 10-ish parameters that come in to electric precision data analyses. So you have a bunch of vertex corrections and things that change vertex corrections. You have these 2 operator forms, which really correspond to S and T, as I introduced them before. and you have this more fermion effect. But it's only about 10 effects, not 2,499, and not even 76, which is the one generation version. And it's mostly because of the narrow resonance of the standard model Z boson that we're using when we're doing this analysis. So we go through this procedure of getting to the pseudo-observables by calculating the partial widths, calculating the total electronic width, basically building these ratios, doing for factor asymmetries, and so on and so forth. And the good news is, and I might be able to say this at the end of the week, we now only have this not only defined at dimension 6, where it was just kind of done by brute force in the SMEFT, just the dimension 6 analysis. We actually have like closed form expressions now that are all orders in the v squared over lambda squared expansion. Like we've solved the theory in that expansion parameter for interpreting vector precision data. And that's using these geometric techniques, which I want to get to at the end of the week. So we just do this, and we can carry the perturbations at dimension 6. So we basically have to do the perturbations of inputs and perturbations of outputs, which is just illustrated with this delta here. The v squared over lambda squared corrections have a particularly important role in terms of redefining what you mean by the gauge couplings. So you get shifts in what you infer of the gauge couplings consistently going through the inputs and mapping them to the numeric values in the Lagrangian. And these shifts generally come about with v squared over lambda squared corrections. And you get different corrections due to different input parameters you can choose. This will get to the W mass, which I'll have to talk about on Thursday. Shifts from Wilson coefficients for different input parameter schemes appear in different ways. You consistently calculate in either scheme, inputs to outputs. And then when you combine up enough global data, that input parameter scheme depends that choice you can make between choosing these as your inputs with the W mass input, or not choosing W mass as an input, but using alpha electroweak as an input. There's differences in intermediate steps of the formulas. When you do the global data analysis and combine enough data, those differences damp out, and you get a consistent conclusion about physics beyond the standard model. But you have to combine a large amount of data for that consistency to appear, and for the input parameter choice to damp out of your global data set. And you can see some very specific differences here. In terms of the W mass shift, when you use the W mass as an input is 0 by definition. Whereas if you don't use the W mass as an input, you get this shift. And similarly, your alpha shift is 0 when you use it as an input. Whereas in this case, it has a shifted effect. You have to use Babel scattering to constrain this. Whereas you have to use a W mass measurement to constrain this for these two different input parameter schemes. Okay. And this is fine. This is consistent with the decoupling theorem and how physics works for effective field theories, because these are effects which are symmetry preserving effects. There's no flavor violating effects here. These are symmetry preserving shifts which are being absorbed in input parameters and the relationships between inputs to outputs in the standard model that don't violate the symmetry breaking structure of the standard model. Okay? And I told you about these differences. Now, I'm probably out of time, but I'm going to try and get to this final point, and I'll stop. So the amazing thing is that not just us, but many, many people did this for many years, and you start to combine up observables. You don't just do left data, you do more data, you do like all this stuff. So you go like you do Babel scattering, you do low energy precision measurements of this form, you keep combining more and more and more data in terms of what was available. And there's still two unconstrained directions that are not able to close and not able to constrain from all of this data, which look like they should be constrained because of the particular forms of the Wilson coefficients that come in the combinations that come in intermediate steps. But then you do the global data set and you still find that you have these two unconstrained directions. And it was kind of a like, what the heck is going on sort of thing for many years. And now we understand that this was a sign of field space geometry being an organizational principle in this theory. Let me try and get to that point. It's pretty cool. Oh, here it is. Okay. So how is field redefinition invariance and field space geometry underlying that fact? It's a very simple argument. It's a very simple thing that's going on. All of those measurements that I was talking about were basically built up out of 3-point functions, like this, that Cliff was talking about. That's kind of essential. And you can do a rescaling on a vector field at linear order in your SMEFT shifts, and it's gauge coupling at linear order. And if you basically align these two shifts, then things that are VG powers, the linear term will cancel. It's that simple, right? You just take V times G, you shift this by plus, you shift this by minus, and then the linear term cancels. The dimension 8 term, the squared term of epsilon, will not cancel, but the linear part, which corresponds to dimension 6, does cancel. It's trivial. And that actually affects your ability to measure combinations of parameters. So what you do is essentially, if you have a massive vector boson like this, and it has these couplings to the fermionic fields with this gauge coupling, and it has its kinetic term and its mass, and you do these sorts of shifts, what happens is this term changes, the canonical normalization that you were asking about changes, but these terms remain invariant, the mass terms and these guys. But this term, you can actually, when you canonically normalize the theory and use the square roots of the field space metrics I was talking to you about and use the LSC procedure, you cancel out that non-canonical normalization. You have to basically do predictions. So that shows up in the following way. This operator form, which is H dagger H, B mu, B mu nu, projected on the 2 to 2 scattering. So projection on 2 to 2 scattering means the Higgs fields have to become vectors. It becomes a V squared over lambda squared times B mu, B mu. Same with the W, V squared over lambda squared times this. This is exactly what you have to do to rescale this B field, to canonically normalize it, and simultaneously rescale this gauge coupling in the same way, just according to that previous argument. And that's exactly what you do in the SMEFT to canonically normalize things to get to something that's just LSZ, interpretable in terms of your experimental result. Now these operator forms, because you're talking about 2 to 2 scattering with no Higgs, the only way they can appear is in terms of the V squared contribution. And it's not, what happens is it's just even more subtle. It's not them exactly that appears, but it's their equation of motion equivalent. Okay, so for 2 to 2 scattering, this operator form uses the equation of motion. This combination of operators corresponds to that operator form projected onto these matrix elements. So these things are equivalent in the field theory for that class of measurements. Same with this other one, which is W mu, W mu nu. I'm highlighting this one in blue and this one in red. This combination in each case corresponds to this canonical normalization effect. And that's the smoking gun, actually, of the geoSMEFT back in electric precision data. Because we do this canonical normalization through these square roots of these metrics I've introduced to do some, to get to the mass eigenstate fields and interpret in terms of LSC. So this transformation through G mu nu square root, this transformation of the gauge couplings, and this transformation of the scalar fields is done. It's these ones that matter because you can build an invariant of this, and it's going to cancel this transformation. This is invariant. And that's exactly what I was saying before would be the sort of rescaling of the vector field and the gauge coupling that would cancel out. And that's actually what we do to canonically normalize theory and basically build up our experimental predictions. And you can see it in the field space geometry very clearly. And so if this was true, this represented in terms of, this is the equivalent of this at linear dimension 6 order. If it was true, then those combinations I just defined for you, which were the equation motion equivalents of the B mu nu, V squared correction, and the W mu nu, V squared correction, should be exactly what appears in combinations in the linear combination in the flat directions in electric precision data. And that's exactly what happens. You get this particular numerical combination of these rescaling effects that appears, and these are the flat directions you find combining up those 100 measurements. And this is one input parameter scheme. If this was true, it has to happen in more than one input parameter scheme because it wasn't fundamentally input parameter scheme dependent. We checked that it happens in both input parameter schemes, and it does. Just the number changes slightly from one input scheme to another input scheme. So this is why electric precision data has 2 flat directions before we measured other things to close those flat directions. And it's a smoking gun of field space geometry understanding the perturbations to the standard model, which is pretty cool because it was sitting there in the data as soon as we basically did things correctly generally. It also tells you to keep all the operators because you don't want to drop an operator form to change subtle things like this happening in the field theory. You break equation of motion equivalence and just make mistakes. Okay, I know I need to finish. I already said this, it's what's there. Now, how do you break this? You break this by either doing Higgs measurements where you have these sorts of couplings around, which breaks this reparameterization, or you basically do 2 to 4 scattering. And people knew historically this lifts the flat directions, and it lifts the flat directions because it breaks this rescaling argument because of this vertex. That's why it works. Okay, I just said that. I'll say it again. I think I have to finish. So I think I can actually get to the end. I'm just going to say people can look at these slides later. There's all sorts of subtleties of which why you should, worry about doing 2 to 4 scattering incorrectly. There's actually a gauge fixing term you can write down which changes this diagram into this one. So you want to be pretty careful about doing this calculation. You want to do actual 2 to 4 scattering and not just cut the diagrams here. And the other reason you don't want to cut the diagrams at that point is because then you have to worry about whether you're doing something that's actually field redefinition and varying in terms of your theoretical description or not. If you do the actual observable for the S matrix element, you'll be fine. But if you start doing things with intermediate cuts, you have to be a bit worried about the field redefinitions going through those intermediate cuts you can introduce. So you just have to be careful in your analysis. We were careful. And being careful, you get to this sort of thing. This is the way that you actually combine up left data with left 2 data, and you find in this 10 parameter Wilson coefficient space, this highly correlated fit space, where this is electric precision data, Z pole data, and you lift the flat direction by including diboson data. And it's highly correlated because you need to lift the flat direction by including the diboson data. And it's true in both input parameter schemes. And this is the sort of interpretation of electric precision data that is being used by the LHC experiments going forward to incorporate into SMEFT analysis. I think I'm done. So it takes this old story, which was just 2 parameters and was kind of an overinterpretation, to essentially a more complicated story where you projected all the other parameters and your constraints get much smaller. You can look at the details of these slides that I have there. So it actually makes a big difference in how you interpret electric precision data. That's it. Sorry I went over, but I wanted to get that final.
Thank you for a nice lecture. We are getting late, but are you all tired? Probably you have some questions.
You can think about questions and we can ask at the start of the next session.
Even if you
That's
don't
better.
have a question today, you can ask.
Yeah, maybe it's better
Yeah.
before we start when we discuss next time.
If you have some quick questions, other questions. Okay. Otherwise, less than Mike. Okay.
Sorry, I went over. So I lost track of time, Kenton. How much did I go over?
15.
That's bad. My bad.
Oh, good.